Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Joy of SharePoint. Today, we're going to be talking about modern architecture for modern SharePoint. So glad to see you guys here. This is quite the hot topic today. And I have with me Stephanie Donahue, also
Hello.
group. Hello. Let me see. Are you seeing my screen? It's not talking to
Um,
me.
we are seeing your screen, but we're also seeing the next slide preview. So that's the side you're showing there. Yeah.
I love technology. That should be it.
There we
Okay.
go.
There we go. And there's blonde Stephanie.
Yeah. One of these days I'll get my profile picture updated.
Oh, you got time. You're the boss, right? You can do whatever you want. So, Stephanie has recently written a blog all about the new recommendations that Microsoft has given us for architecture with modern sites, be that team sites, Microsoft team sites, communication sites, all that fun stuff. In fact, rumor is that blog was good enough. We got some folks inside Microsoft that actually reference it. Is it bragging too much if you confirm that?
Well, I may have gotten a couple retweets from the product group, so that was appreciated. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Way to go. She doesn't like to brag about herself, folks, so we have to push her sometimes.
Yeah, I didn't make that title on this slide either. Thanks, Joy.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's just a little fun I get to have since this is, technically my webinar. So, well, to kick off, I'm going to get you guys that are out and about in the world today involved. I've got a quick poll, and I'm going to launch that just to kind of get an idea of where you guys are in terms of this whole new architecture content that's out there. Um, I know some of the folks that I've been talking to, they've heard that it's out there, but they're not super familiar with it, or they've read it and they don't really understand, or what's the point. So I'm just kind of curious where you guys are, looking at the numbers as they roll in. I got 25% saying a site collection for everything. What the heck? That's a common theme I'm hearing from people. 32% are saying they're on board with it. Linda, hey, she just got her new modern site. Congratulations. 19 are saying, I'm not super familiar with it. I'm glad you're here. This will be a great introduction for it. Stephanie, as you've been talking to folks, what's kind of the prevalent opinion for this new architecture idea?
Well, I'd say for those that have SharePoint experience, that they've been around for a while and they've had site collections with subsites for quite some time, I think this is something that's really difficult to put your arms around. I think it's a pretty big mindset shift, and so it's something that we actually. What's funny, we were at a conference and we had a guy who just outright refused and
Oh,
said, find me someone else that can give me a different opinion. And that other person gave the same opinion. And it was like, nope, nope, this is the way things are going. So some are not ready to embrace the new modern architecture. And that, like I said, that tends to come from those that have been around SharePoint for a while.
mhm.
For those that are new to SharePoint, and we have a lot of those now with Office 365, a lot of people rolling into SharePoint that have never used it before. And so I think it makes a little more sense for those in the cloud that are just getting to know the platform. It's a little easier.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's see, I've got about 80% of you guys that have voted. I'm going to close the poll here in just a few seconds. If anyone else wants to, go ahead and jump in. I've got one comment here saying that the biggest issue with the idea of a flat architecture is shared lookup columns. Okay.
You know, we're not, we're, I don't think we're going to get that deep today, but this is something that is being addressed with site designs and with hubs. So if we don't get to that today, towards the end when we get into hubs, Darlene, I am publishing a new blog article on hub sites, and it kind of alludes to how that's being handled moving forward. So we actually have good news in that category for you. There is a path forward. So let's not get into that quite yet, but we'll see how much time we have towards the end, and see if we can address that when we get there.
Perfect. Well, I've got 85% voted. I'm going to give it to the count of 3, 2, 2.5, 1, and I am closing the poll. Thank you, thank you, thank you for voting. That lets us know kind of where you guys are, what you're thinking about it. Looks like the majority of us are kind of in that, are you kidding me, Microsoft, a site collection for everything. That's okay. We're going to talk about it. We all had the same thought, right? So, Stephanie, I completely stole this from the blog that I referenced earlier. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and confess now, a lot of the images, the architecture images you guys see are Stephanie's. She did the legwork here. I'm not even going to pretend I did these. So, Stephanie, I think we're looking at one of the approaches people used to take with their intranet design. And this, I would say, would have been what I would tend to call a lowercase best practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that, you know, for those that have been in SharePoint for a while, you have on-premises systems, this layout should look familiar to you. Very often what we saw was a root site collection and then a bunch of subsites or pages off of that root site that would be essentially your intranet. Right? So you've got your home page, you've got your news, and then, you know, you have your breakout sites. Maybe HR has things like policies and benefits. IT has your support help desk number and maybe some help articles, things like that. Finance, that's going to be your expense forms, right? So that structure very easily allows you to have an intranet where, despite having different sites, you have all of the same security. You know, maybe everyone has a read-only access, and then you still have that ability to have a separate IT site, a separate HR site for the more secure documents. So that was definitely our best practice originally. Say, you know, you control the security in your root site collection for mostly reading, mostly open, and then you would break out into separate site collections, and that's what each of those blocks to the right represent. Secure areas where HR could then manage more secure information, or IT could collaborate on things that didn't need to be shared with everyone else. So that was probably one of the more common ways that we would come out and say, this is how you should structure your sites in an on-premises environment.
And it kind of follows suit for, and I think we'll see this throughout all the little examples we have. If any of you guys out there have ever had me come in and do some training, or if you've sat in on any of my other webinars where we talked about security and even some of our deployment planning workshops, one thing I like to point out when it comes to architecting is use security to help drive your organization. And this does exactly that. That publishing content is for everyone. That's what I tend to call your company public content. And then those other collaboration sites are for your department private information. So it's broken out according to who's doing what, who should be able to get to what. So security is absolutely driving that architecture. And one of the things that Stephanie noted out in her blog there, that second bullet point, your more complex, pretty branding is easily inherited in one. So those publishing sites have that pretty branding. And you know, in your working sites, who cares quite so much about it looking gorgeous? You're just there to work, right?
Well, it makes it complicated to manage, right? If you overbrand your collaboration sites, then it's harder for those power users to kind of edit the page and get the important information surfaced on there in a dynamic environment where some of that content changes a lot faster than it would on a basic intranet publishing page.
And I would say even going forward, that's still a good thing to keep in mind, guys.
Yeah, it's not a bad structure. And if you're still on premises and you don't have some of the newer features that SharePoint Online has, this is still absolutely a perfectly acceptable way of arranging your intranet sites.
Definitely. Let's look at option 2 for the legacy intranet approach. That it's kind of deep, right? We're not going left to right. We're not building out a lot of site collections, but boy, we sure are doing a deep dive here.
Yes, and we saw that in scenarios where maybe we had users that would struggle to understand, why do I go to 2 different sites? If I'm in HR, I now have to manage one HR site on the intranet and a separate HR site and a different site collection. And we had some customers that just found like that was too challenging and that they just wanted everything in one place. And so what they would do instead is just create a sub-site for HR and then create a second sub-site under that for a more secure HR area. And that way you weren't jumping between sites in order to kind of get to your secured content. Now, this one less ideal, right? Because as you break permissions, within the single site, you are creating the risk of accidentally giving someone access to something that they shouldn't have access to. Especially important when you get into things like HR, if you've got information in there that really shouldn't be shared, maybe employee review, that sort of thing. It's really important to make sure that that security structure is clean. And when you create subsite and a subsite, it's very easy to quickly get lost in kind of traversing sites and knowing who has permission to what. There are great permission tools out there created specifically because this structure was so common. Lightning Tools has one, right? It goes out, it scans your permissions, and it tells you what sites have what permission. That whole tool is generated because there were many sites set up like this.
Yeah, and this, like you said, it looks like a security nightmare to me. So many times you see where people will break permissions on something and go, okay, it broke permissions, and walk away and not actually modify them in any way. So yeah, here you see a lot of risk for people getting into places where they really don't need to be. So this was the less than ideal, still kind of a common approach to how we're going to now call legacy architect for our site collections and our environments. Now let's jump forward to 2018. Now how we have a more modern approach. And Stephanie, I really like how you color coded, especially the teams being purple, since that's the team's color. I enjoy
totally
that.
Planned. I'm sure I planned that.
I'm sure you did. Roll with it. Roll with it.
So what we have here is kind of a new way of thinking of things, a new approach. And part of this approach has been brought to the surface because of the way that Microsoft Teams works. So if you're not familiar with Microsoft Teams, it essentially it just provides a chat-based tool with an interface back into SharePoint. So when you create a Microsoft team, you now have this conversation thread available to you, but it's also connected on the back side. So you have Planner connected, you have SharePoint connected, you have an area in Microsoft Stream for video. So it's kind of creating this collection of applications, and Teams gives you this ability to kind of see all of those different applications from one interface, and that's really where Teams came into the picture. So since it develops a SharePoint, or it creates a SharePoint team site on the backside, we now have to consider that as part of your SharePoint architecture when you're doing the planning, which kind of mixes things up a little bit here, right? So if you create a team, it creates a SharePoint site collection. And so we have to consider, okay, well, if we're using Teams, then what do we use SharePoint for? And that's potentially why part of you are here, right? It's like, well, when do I use Teams? When do I use SharePoint? There's different kinds of SharePoint sites. So, why would I go one way versus the other? And to further complicate things, I see we do have a question from Darlene. Why a classic root site? And yes, that is not modern, and that is actually forced right now. So that further complicates the matter. We can't fully transition to modern sites, even if 365 and SharePoint Online is brand new to us. So that the classic root site collection is the only option that Microsoft provides to us right now. So we kind of have to sort through all of this and say, well, what's going to be the easiest way to use all of these tools to keep everything organized and to make sure that we have our security right for all of them. And so that's why I put this approach together, because I felt like I had this conversation over and over and over, and I'm like, you know what? I need to blog this so I can send it to people because it's easier to understand in a visual format. So
a picture's always worth 1,000 words.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, so what you're looking at here is that same concept of what we saw in the more traditional legacy site structures, but laid out in such a way that we now have a very straightforward way to explain to our users when to use which product, right? So for our Contoso homepage, right, and Contoso, the company that exists for Microsoft for years and years, right? So let's say that's our root site collection. And so we have to have classic. So we have, so one point on that, you have a classic root site, but you can create modern pages for a classic site collection. So keep that in mind. They're kind of blending and blurring the lines. So even though you're stuck with the classic root site collection, you can add some modern pages to it. So that's what your root site is, and you can use that for maybe news roll-ups, application links, maybe embedding videos. This is your traditional intranet homepage that you can use to launch everything else that you have available. But then you can also take advantage of the new modern communication sites. And now these are going to be the modern site template, mobile friendly, and you can spin them up very easily as just a SharePoint site. There's nothing else attached. There's no Active Directory group. There's no Microsoft team. It's just a modern SharePoint team site, modern communication site template. So kind of just a SharePoint site in its own little silo. And the reason that I like to do that separate from your homepage is because what do people want from their phones? They want news, right? So you have this capability of creating a communication site. It'll give everyone their news. They can pull it up on their phone. It works great. So maybe we want to keep that separate from that root site. And then we can, again, control the security however we need to on that. So the direction we go here, and the confusion that always happened with SharePoint, the legacy SharePoint, was that, well, if I use SharePoint for collaboration and I use SharePoint for my publishing intranet site where I'm pushing information, but it's mostly read-only, that's where the confusion came in on, do I need a site collection? Do I need a sub-site? Now we have very clear lines. Create a SharePoint site for publishing information, for sharing information, for mostly read-only. That's exactly what that communication site is for. And then you can launch into Teams for your file share replacement, for collaboration within SharePoint, because now you've got this chat platform that is associated to it. So now you have this very easy division. Instead of saying, which HR site do I go to? Do I go to the site collection for secure information? Do I go to the home page for my shared information? It's still SharePoint, and that's confusing. But now we have this, I go to SharePoint for my intranet, and now I go to Teams for my collaboration. And now we have very clear lines on how to separate all of that, right? So with our modern sites, it is recommended that you do a high-level site collection as opposed to doing all the subsites underneath those. So that's the basic breakdown that you're looking at here. Root site, modern communication sites for your intranet, and Teams, which create a SharePoint team site for your collaboration. So that's the structure we're trying to go for here. So, sorry, go ahead, Joy.
So here's a little closer look of that little call out, which kind of is company public in one place, which is your communication, and then department private in another, which is your collaborative effort that's taking place in Teams. Or let's say we're not ready for Teams yet. I mean, that's an easy swap out for just a modern team site.
Yep. We have one question here that I did want to address. Can you go back to the other slide for just a second? So I think it'll be easier to address that. Sorry, I know I'm mixing things up on you here.
No
Okay,
problem.
so one of the questions is that, you know, they're challenging me on the fact that the modern site does create a group. The communication site template does not create a group. The modern team site does create a group. So there's a difference there. You have two different templates, the communication site, just a SharePoint site. The modern team site does create the group. So one point of you know, differentiation there. Now, I'm a big fan of sticking with communication sites for your intranet, doing teams for collaboration. The middle ground there is if I create a modern team site in SharePoint, it is spinning up, you know, Planner and all that stuff in the background, and an Active Directory group to help you control all of those applications. So slight difference between the two. There are scenarios where if you're not ready to roll out teams, that you could roll out the modern team sites and groups instead. But we're not going to get too much into that today, but I did want to address the difference, that the modern team sites are not created equal there. So, okay, what's the next question here? Is that,
Best practices for content sharing. Is that the one you're looking at?
Yep. I think so, yep.
So we've got a question here with a flat architecture. Any best practices for content sharing and distribution between different SharePoint online sites outside of the hub concept? Single document library with a wider audience on the company intranet. Typically in that scenario, if let's say I'm the IT department, just cause, and I've got this little segment of information that is company public, right? Everyone on the company needs to get to. I would say you could flip a coin here and either have that content available on that root intranet site or your IT publishing site where everybody's going to have access to it. That communication site would be a good place to put that information. What would your thought be there, Stephanie?
You know, the most common scenario that happens is that we have a group that maybe needs to collaborate on a draft, but then share the final version of that. And I think that's where most of that infighting is, like, where does that information belong, right? And it's maybe one library, it's a policies and procedures library. A lot of times what we'll see is that you can work on that draft in your team, your Microsoft team or your modern team site, work on the draft there, you have the co-authoring with Word, and then you publish that PDF, and then you can push that PDF into the communication site. For everyone else to see. So you're kind of drawing a line and saying this is where we collaborate and this is where we push that information to actually be shared and consumed by others. And that also gives us, you think about the policies and procedures side of things, it gives us a place to collaborate, but then, and we don't have to worry about metadata tagging. You know, we all know the structure of our stuff that we work on every day. But then when we publish it to a communication site, we can now tag it with the appropriate tags so that it shows up for someone else to find it more easily. So there's kind of a different way of looking at that as well now. We may not keep everything in one place. We might split it out based on how it's consumed and what security is needed. And that would be different for the same document as if it was Word versus a PDF published final version. So some, you know, food for thought there. All right. Gosh, we have lots of questions. Do we? I'm going to spin through these, and maybe Joy, you can advance to the next slide, and we'll try to tackle this. So, next question: can I migrate existing SharePoint 2013 info path form libraries to SharePoint modern sites without group enabled? Yes, you can. So InfoPath comes over, SharePoint Designer comes over. You can bring those all into your modern sites or into, so again, it goes back to, you can create a modern site with a classic view. You can create a classic site with a modern view. You can mix and match. So in general, you should be able to bring existing InfoPath forms in to SharePoint Online without too much trouble. You're just going to run into differences code behinds and things like that if you have complex info path forms. So, okay.
The classic experience, and you still have that ability inside your libraries to turn them back to classic.
Yep. So the info path deprecation, that is still, I think it's like 2026 or something like that. You have a long time. So yeah, you can absolutely, while you're transitioning info path into something like Power Apps, you've got a long time to move that stuff forward. All right. Let's see, what else do we, gosh, lots of questions still coming in.
So one here, I think it's going to tie in about like, where do I put standards that I write for developers if I'm in IT? Well, if that is internal only information, it's for your IT developers and they have access to your IT collaboration site, I would say that's where they would go because it's internal information. So really when you're thinking about architecture, your objectives are to have a site, here we might say site collection, for a purpose and a function. So if it's for just you and the rest of your department or your team, that would more than likely be your communication space, whereas or your collaboration space, whereas the intranet publishing sites would be that communication site template where everyone in the company can come and get information that you're sharing for the whole company.
Yep. So that's part of why, kind of touching back on the site collection versus the subsite, right? It is to help you kind of create silos so that you are not chasing down those permissions. You're really separating that concept of saying, if I'm a power user and I'm responsible for a single project team, I have a single group of people I'm managing, I have a single group of content, I have a single group of applications that we're all using to collaborate together. And then if I need to share it, I can publish any of that content somewhere else, right? So I think it makes the lines a little more clear in terms of how to distribute that content, right?
Absolutely.
So there was one other up here, and for those that are still kind of fighting, like, okay, fine, but what if I do need that classic experience? You can create those pages, but I would also challenge you to look at things a different way. Sometimes we feel like we need the classic experience when the modern actually provides some things that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So there's a lot of workarounds right now. Joy, I know you ran into one. You just did a blog where you found a way to display a list in a page with the JSON, and you guys know how you can now kind of color code your columns in SharePoint. Well, when you add it to the modern page, it doesn't show up how you expect, and so the default is to go, well, I must just need a classic site for that, right? But Joy found a way to embed that instead, so she could still display that content and do it in a way that has that modern look and feel. So there are ways. Sometimes you just kind of have to find new ways of doing things. But I'd certainly challenge that there are certainly scenarios where you just need classic, and that's just how it's going to be, right?
And if you want ideas, I will say go to Twitter. If you don't have a Twitter account, create one. I promise you it's worth it, because Office 365 has a Twitter account, SharePoint has a Twitter account, right? All these Microsoft products have Twitter accounts, and you can follow blogs, you can get new ideas. There's just some really good information to kind of help you, start thinking about how to adapt or how to work with this new experience we're kind of getting into.
All right.
So when do we use what, right? We got options out there. We got modern team sites, communication sites, Teams sites, classic team sites. Does anyone else get the feeling that the word team is used almost too much anymore? We need a new word. So it's a lot of options out there. And Stephanie, I don't know about you, but I know the folks I talk to, they just feel like they have too many options and they haven't found some clear guidance on when to use what.
Yeah, and I feel like that tends to lead us towards we'll use this in this scenario and use this in that scenario, and then you kind of traverse through these like 8 different applications, and you're like, how am I ever going to keep everything straight when I have 18 options to do any one thing? And part of that, and this is something I know that you spend a lot of time on, Joy, is governance and communication to your team on, how are we as a company going to use this information as well, right? There's not necessarily a wrong way of doing it, but maybe there's a way that's more beneficial, that would help you take advantage of more features. And I know, Joy, you do a lot of that with your deployment planning conversations.
I do, and that's fun because and IT guys out there, gals, folks, that you sit down and you work with your business departments and your business teams, have those conversations. Sit down and talk with them and say, what do you do every day? How do you work? What kind of content do you work with? The answers to those questions will help you demystify what you're needing where. I promise. They can be long conversations, but they are so worth it. But a goal is for every site you create to have a function. So, Stephanie, let's walk through kind of some of the ideas. And again, I think I stole a lot of this from your blog again, because why not? It was there. Why reinvent that wheel?
What we're looking at here is further defining our silos, and I did see a question about this, that was posted in here. It's like, well, when would I even use that type of site, right? So let's break that down for a minute and let's figure that out. Typically, when, let's say, okay, I'm in SharePoint, we know our root site collection's classic. Where do I go from there? So the first thing you're going to do is sit down and say, okay, for our intranet, if SharePoint's truly our central place, our central launch point for news, communications, documents that the entire company needs to see, that sort of information, that's perfect for communication sites. So you can break those down and say, okay, we're going to give HR their own communication site to manage. We're going to give IT their own communication site to manage. And now you've got those clean silos of who manages the site, and then giving everyone else access to come in and read that site if they want, right? So communication sites, since they don't spin up all of those other pieces and parts in 365, they don't have that extra group, they don't have Stream, they don't have Planner, they're just SharePoint. That's perfect for doing an intranet. So that's where we would point you for that, pretty clean cut and easy to use, right? The new communication sites, they're modern, they're easy to kind of adjust the layout on the page. Those are things you should be able to hand off to your power users within each group to manage and update their own intranet sites. Again, trying to get things out of IT and get them into the hands of the business users, so that you can increase that user adoption, keep that dynamic content going on the page. And then the other side of that, what we talked about earlier with teams, those are going to be best in scenarios where you have a lot of collaboration. This is absolutely your file share replacement. Now, I'm not saying move your entire file share into Teams. That's not going to work either.
Not ever. Please don't.
Yeah, please don't. But it is the place you want to look at and say, okay, we've got this group that we're working with, and maybe it's a project team, and that project team, we're a functional group. We don't fit into a single department. Maybe we're cross-department, cross-functional, but we all have the same goal and the same, end result that we're trying to get to on this project. So we spin up a team for that. So that's where, now we can start doing multiple projects. If I'm on 5 projects, I have 5 project teams. Each of those project teams has their own SharePoint site collection on the backside. And when that project is over, now we've got the archiving. Teams has archiving, project's over, it's out of the picture. And we have that retention policy now where we can get rid of it. So another reason to have site collections instead of subsites. Spin up what you need, use it while you need it, and then kick it out to your retention policies to get rid of it long term. So those are great scenarios for using Teams, because they are flexible, dynamic, they have integrations into other systems, maybe project team needs to integrate with Jira, that's an IT tool, then it has integrations, it has connectors. HR, maybe they're planning an event, they have a team for that, and maybe it integrates with SurveyMonkey, and it posts every time they get something back from SurveyMonkey, it posts into the chat in Teams. So there's a lot of reasons to kind of spin out teams for those types of scenarios, that that things that we've not had in the past with just having a SharePoint site. And then last we have, just that classic team site or publishing site, or when would we roll back to classic? And sometimes that comes up a little more often when we have customizations. We need to throw a little bit of client-side code into the page. You can handle that with SharePoint Framework Web Parts in Modern, but not everybody has developers on staff. Maybe you're not prepared to do that. Sometimes it's easier to roll back to a classic site. So those are kind of the main scenarios there that we tend to lean on. I'd add a fourth to this, actually. I'm going to sidebar here because the question did come up. What if I have a modern team site? And you can roll out modern team sites without the group attached if you're not ready to deal with groups and teams. And so that might be an option for you. You do have to do that through PowerShell, but you could just spin up a modern team site in SharePoint and work from there. And that way you have the new modern experience and the new features, but then you don't have to manage everything else that comes with it. If you do that, you can groupify it later, you can hubify it later, you can teamify it later, all the F5s.
I love all the new words we're getting.
Yeah, you can do a lot with that stuff. So you do have that fourth option as well, but I wouldn't start there. I would definitely plan to use the communication sites and team sites if you're ready for that.
And this might be a topic for another webinar on another day, but Office 365 groups, they're kind of foggy for a lot of folks in the world today. Just a little blurb to get you thinking about maybe using those. They're basically a distribution list on steroids. So if you're in an organization that loves your DL lists, do some reading on your Office 365 groups, because not only do you get that shared inbox, but you get permissions through other apps you may use pretty seamlessly. So it's definitely worth investigating. We're not going to do a deep dive into that by any means, but I just thought I would throw that out since I'm seeing that come up a lot in the questions. So every site has a function. What the word that was not included in the title of this slide is every site collection has a function. So where the rubber starts to really meet the road, though, is in terms of navigation. So we all know our sub-site navigation rolls up to the parent site, but, site collection URLs and links don't ever roll up anywhere. So that's annoying. So Stephanie, now I've got a site collection for everybody. Navigation. What's your number one piece of advice for managing that navigation?
Yeah, and I think that's always the biggest fear, right? Because if you've been around SharePoint for a while, you'll know that every time you add a site collection, you have to go manually add that to the navigation on your classic root site collection, which just feels daunting and overwhelming. And you're thinking, we're scaling, and now Teams has all of these sites that it's spinning up, and we have all these communication sites that are individual, and you expect me to keep track of all these sites and add them to navigation manually? You're nuts, right? I think that's where the fear goes. It's just like, oh my gosh, how can we possibly keep track of all of this? And that's really where the hub sites come in. And that's how we're going to address kind of keeping track of all of these miscellaneous site collections that are getting added. So, and the downside is right now, if you're not using Teams or you are not using hubs, they are rolled out now, by the way. Hubs are 100% rolled out, so you should have them available. But we did have some for a while during the transition period where you did have to update your navigation manually. Now that hub sites are available, we have that ability to go back to that same concept that we love of having subsites, having sites that are all belonging together, right? You're probably fighting that urge. Okay, you talked about project sites. Now we have 200 project sites. How do we track them all, right? That's where the hub comes in. Now we have a project hub, and we add all of our project teams or team sites available to that hub. And now we have navigation. We have the ability to roll up news and announcements, calendar items. We can see all of that on one landing page. And so now if I'm responsible over all the project teams, I have a single landing page. I can see some of that information rolling up to that. So this is really where the navigation comes back in. So hopefully the navigation you're updating manually is just to, here's my project hub, you know, here's my departments hub, here's my operations hub, right? So you're maybe updating 3 navigation links instead of 300.
Yes.
So that's really where the hub is pretty stellar.
Well, I have a group of folks I was working with recently, and they have, I don't remember their internal terminology, but a division of quality. And under quality, they have 3 or 4, we'll call it departments just for a word, that roll up under the banner of quality, right? And each one works pretty independently, but then they've got standards and procedures that do need to be shared throughout all of those departments that fall under quality. So that's this exact scenario, right? You have a quality hub site, and then those independent department collaboration sites that roll up under it. It's the perfect solution for them.
Yep, absolutely.
And it stays flat.
And it's all flat, yeah. So, and the hub is just a site collection. You're just going to spend, I think you've got a slide here for that. Why don't you go ahead and advance the slides here?
Oh, yeah. Well, that seems to be a little out. We'll come back to this one. How about that?
All right, that sounds good. Yeah, let's go here first. So what happens is, in order to create a hub, all you're doing is creating a site collection. This is nothing fancy. You're just going to say, okay, give me a site. And then that previous slide that Joy had, you're just going to run some PowerShell and you're going to call it a hub. You hubify it, right? I saw these technical terms.
But so technical.
Yeah, but when you hubify it, your architecture still stays flat. If I add my news and my HR to a hub, they still stay a site collection. They're not being added as a subsite. They're not seen truly as like being under the hub from an architecture perspective, but they are now grouped. So you're not only sharing the content, you have the ability to share the site design, the theme, the logo. So you're passing some of those additional things down to those sites and getting into even content types. You can now run site scripts. If I add a project site to the project hub, I could then have it launch a script that then rolls out content types and lists and maybe my issues list that I've customized and, you know, certain content to that site. I have that ability. It's almost like creating a template, but you're adding things to the site after the fact. So when you add the site to the hub, it's rolling out those customizations because it says, oh, you're a project site. You need X, Y, and Z to be part of this hub. So we're going to roll out some of this content to you because we know you need it. So really interesting concept here where we're taking, it's almost like, and I don't want to call it a template. It's more like kind of cloning of sorts, but it's really improving our ability to create consistency between sites that we consider to be associated to each other.
I call them, usually when I'm having like my one-on-one conversations, I kind of refer to the hub sites as the mothership.
That's a good way of looking at it.
Rolls up to it. So if anyone gets my little reference on this slide, please feel free to chime in. But it's like this one mothership that's going to give us a place where content is rolled up. I can see the news and events. Information is shared from the mothership, right? You can see it all in one place, but then still get to those individual sites for those specific purposes, processes, topics. Security is still respected, right? You're not changing the security of any sites when you join it to a hub site. So just know that that is in place. So now I'll back up and we'll get to, you know, Lori says she uses mothership analogy all the time in training. Rock on, Lori. Great minds think alike. So how do you get a hub site? There is the instructions under docs.microsoft.com. It's not terribly hard. You basically run the register command in PowerShell, and I am not a PowerShell guru. And if I say it's not complicated, I promise it's not complicated. But there are other options as well that the document has. So you can either jot down this, we'll have this available as a recording. We can get slides out to you guys, we can get information out to you guys, or you can just go to Google and say, create SharePoint hub site, and this will probably be your first hit. It's not difficult. Just takes a little while. Well, no, I shouldn't even say that, because it took a little while for my script to take place, because that was when we were still in preview. But very painless, very easy.
And I do expect, if you're not familiar, Microsoft Ignite is next week. And that is the big, big technical conference that Microsoft puts on every year. There's 35,000 people there. This is where they save all of their good stuff and they announce it at this conference. So if you're not familiar, a lot of this may change. This is PowerShell right now. I expect this to come to the GUI soon, I would hope. So, I mean, those are the types of announcements that you want to be looking for. This may be getting even easier. So make sure you go out to the, I believe it's msignite.microsoft.com. You can register and watch these sessions live. And you can, so go out and search for hub sites, search for teams, search for Power Apps and Flow, and find the sessions that you want, because a lot of the stuff's going to be talked about next week, and it's all available to you. There's no cost to sign up. You just jump in, you watch the sessions. You can kind of do that as you're doing other things at work. So this is an area I would watch, because I do think this is getting easier.
Nothing wrong with easy, though I will say some people are a little irritated at how easy it is for people to create sites now, but there is control over that. Anything that you're seeing today, you can go in and control and have governance around who can create sites, who can run PowerShell scripts against your site collection, right? All of that's controllable. So let me back up to this guy. Do we have any other questions out there? We're getting close to using up your whole hour. Any questions about this architecture? Anything we could hopefully address in a few minutes? And then we have an offer you may not be able to refuse coming up. I'm going to take a second and go back through.
And hopefully we've changed your mind a little bit if you were on the what the heck, why do I need a site collection for everything bandwagon. Hopefully we're changing your mind there a little bit. I do want to be clear though, there are instances where subsites still make sense and where classic sites still make sense. It is not a one-for-one. You know, if you've got a whole bunch, I think the subsite, it's like 2,000 subsites are supported for every site collection, something like that. If you have a bunch of subsites and you just don't want to blow out a bunch of site collections, you don't have to. I mean, this is not something where subsites are not going away. I thought Heather Newman wrote a great article on that, right? She's kind of like, you know, don't sound the alarm. There's no reason to panic. This is something you can work away from as needed over time in phases, and not every single site has to be brought to the surface. You may see more features at the site collection level. You might have a better experience with permissions. You are going to definitely have better performance the higher level you stay on your sites. But there's no reason to be panicking, right? We've got a lot of time to transition into this new modern architecture.
And if you've ever been in this situation where you're trying to defolder your SharePoint libraries, because, right, you've heard people preach for a long time that the deeper your folder structure is in your libraries, the harder it can be to manage. And we're kind of seeing how Microsoft is going, okay, just like deep folder structures are not ideal in your libraries, deep subsite structures are not ideal in your site collection, right? There's always been an idea of flat architecture with SharePoint. So we're just kind of expanding on that philosophy. And even I, who, I mean, hate's a strong word, but I kind of hate folders in my libraries, I still would never tell someone you should never use a folder, because sometimes it just makes sense. So same thing. No one's going to tell you you should never use a subsite because sometimes it just makes sense.
We have another question here, so I'm going to jump back in. So, Kurt, you mentioned that your primary goal is to migrate off of a large network file share. So, Teams is the file share replacement, but the question is, what do you do if you're not moving your entire file share? What does that mean, and how does OneDrive fit into that picture? So, first, let me address OneDrive versus Teams. So, I see OneDrive for Business as being your personal work file share, right? So if you have a personal drive mapping, that goes into OneDrive for Business. Easy peasy. If you have Dropbox going on, you have Box, that goes into OneDrive for Business, right? That's where that stuff goes. That's a one-to-one sharing. That's it. Basically what it comes down to is if you get promoted and the content needs to be given to the next person in line, it doesn't belong in your OneDrive. OneDrive is for things like your version of your employee review. Maybe one time you had to share one thing with one vendor, you never need it again. That's a great reason to use OneDrive. But if it really belongs to your role, then that really belongs in your department site so that someone can reference it later. Maybe the next person that comes along needs to know how much you paid on that invoice. That's not your invoice, it's the department's invoice, right? So that really goes into SharePoint or into Teams. So then when we're looking at file shares in general, what we look for is the active content. That's the main thing you're trying to do there. So if you want to move into Teams and you move 100% of your files over, you're moving over log files from 2005. You don't need those, right? Executables, somebody's video files or pictures of their kids that they moved out there, right? Like you don't need that stuff in Teams because what happens is you go to use search, and they have junk in search and nobody can find anything to begin with. So we want to move only the important active content. If you're on previous versions of SharePoint, you get all that version history. But on file shares, you've got version 1, version 2, version 3, version 6. Nobody knows where 4 and 5 is. It's in a different folder. Like you don't need 5 versions of the same document. Take the most recent one, bring it over, edit from there. Right? So those are the sorts of things we start digging into so that we're not recreating that mess in the new version or in the cloud. And that takes time. But trust me, it'll be worth your time to maybe move over in phases to make sure that you're not recreating the noise in Teams that you had on your file share. So, all right, next question, enterprise-wide search. So site searches are scoped to collections and hub sites, but what if you want to find things across the entire tenant? You still have the ability to use the enterprise search. There should still be an everything search available to you. So enterprise-wide search, I'm still a fan. And we also, you can use search for roll-ups. So something that even outside of your hub sites, if you're wanting to surface something in that classic root site collection, you can use search to do that. So enterprise-wide search, still very helpful, still exists. You still have that tenant-wide search available to you. Let's see, can we link a hub to another hub? No, definitely not. So it is, I think there are limitations to the number of hubs you have, but you can connect a lot. I think it's a tremendous number of sites to a hub, but you cannot connect a hub to another hub. So there's no structuring of kind of that substructure. It is one hub and then site collections below it, and that is it. So you can detach a site from a hub though, if you decide later, this isn't the right hub for this site, or maybe your company reorganizes, you can kind of rearrange site collections and add them to different hubs. That's fine, but you cannot add a hub to another hub.
I think the only option there would be to literally create a manual link somewhere, but you would want to make sure that that really, really, really made sense security-wise and business-wise.
Yeah, and it just takes some time to think out, what belongs where. And again, that goes back to who owns the content, who publishes the content, who consumes the content. And then once you've got your security silos figured out, that'll help you figure out what belongs where and how it's associated.
So let's cruise on over to this next slide here. So does this sound familiar to any of you guys on the phone? You are on the call. You've kind of worked with some SharePoint before, but it maybe didn't go very well, or you've got it and boy, it could really do more, but right now people just dump their files there. It's basically your online file share. You got SharePoint, but wait a minute, there's Teams, but what about this thing called OneDrive? Where do I put my stuff? How does this all work together? So Stephanie, this is your brainchild, I believe.
Yes, so this is the kind of thing that we typically do under deployment vouchers. If you have software assurance, you get these vouchers from Microsoft, and so you can get that kind of planning covered for free. But what I'm trying to work on is a new approach to this. I would like to reach more people. And not everybody has the funds. I hear all the time, I don't have the funds. We can't bring one person in to do the planning for us. So I'm kind of just doing this thing on my own. And what I'd like to start doing is creating groups where if you're willing to work with others like you, that we could get a group of people on the phone and work with, maybe 4 companies at the same time and jump on a webinar call, right, a screen share and say, okay, let's go through this deployment planning process and how can we help you through that? And you can learn from me, you can learn from others. And the first group that we're doing is totally free. Because it's a beta group and I want to give this a try. So we are looking for folks that might be interested in participating at no cost. It is an abbreviated version of the bigger one, the bigger planning session. But going forward, we'll also be looking to expand this into something as a paid offering, but we want to keep it affordable. So this is something that, if you're a small company or you're a one-man band and you're trying to do it all, maybe this might be an opportunity that you'd be interested in. So if this is something up your alley, would love to hear from you, would love feedback. But again, we would be sharing content with other organizations under, some kind of NDA. And so would love to hear from you guys if you think this is something that you'd be interested in. All right.
All right. And that brings us about to the end. 3 minutes to spare on your lunch break. Appreciate you guys joining in. Thank you for all the questions. If there's some questions out there that we didn't answer, Steph and I will both kind of go back through them and we'll tag team making sure answers get out to you guys. And there will be a recording available later. But thank you so very much, Stephanie. Thank you for coming and being a part of the webinar today.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
All right. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to hang out just a little while in case any late questions come in, but otherwise I'm going to go on mute, and you guys all have an awesome rest of the week.
Thanks, everybody.